I'm Sam, I'm from Wildings Cider. We're based here in North Somerset in 𝗬𝗲𝗀, and we're grower cider makers, so we're growing the fruit in our own orchard and in other orchards that we manage locally, other people's orchards. And we're making fine natural cider, so we're trying to make something which is quite full flavoured, using quite a bit of acid fruit as well. So it's something that it works really well with food, I think, and it's more of a sort of sipping cider, if you like, rather than a pints of cider kind of cider. What natural cider means to me anyway is it means we're growing the fruit organically, so we don't use any pesticides, no herbicides, no insecticides in the or fungicides in the orchard. We then we pick everything by hand. That's not necessarily essential for natural cider, but for my view is that the key to making a really good natural cider is the best quality fruit you can possibly get, and I think hand picking for us is a big part of that. And then we ferment it with wild yeasts exclusively. We don't add sulfites at any stage. We don't add anything else. So we're not chaptalizing with sugar. We're not adding sugar at the end. We're not adding anything to adjust for acid in either direction, and we're not filtering it, we're not pasteurizing it, and we're not adding sulfites or bottling. So it's a very, very straightforward approach in many ways, and I think it puts the apple center stage rather than the maker. Some people say low intervention, and I guess that's where we would fit, but I don't really like that, because that suggests you're not doing anything. We do stuff, but we're not adding stuff, and the stuff we do is quite gentle. So we're looking at like the fruit selection is a huge thing. The blending, most of our blending happens during harvest season rather than blending later. So we're blending sort of the fresh juice rather than the fermented cider. But that's a huge part of it. The hygiene is a big part of it, and then the growing is a big part of it. So getting the right fruit in the first place. And I think you can. It doesn't matter what you do to a cider. If the fruit's not good, you'll never have a good cider. And if it doesn't taste ripe, if the fruit's not ripe, it cannot ever ripen. You can leave it for as long as possible. But I've tried ciders that have been 12, 13 years old, not ours, made with fruit that doesn't taste ripe, and they still don't taste ripe. They still taste like an apple on the tree 3 weeks before harvest is how the cider tastes after 13, 14 years. So I think that's our kind of style, that's our kind of approach basically. It's a very fruit orchard centered. I try and spend as little time as possible in the cider house actually doing any making. I try and spend as much time as possible in the orchard trying to grow the fruit as well as possible basically. The idea for distilling first came around a combination of two things. One is that we have been, because we're quite new and because the orchards that we're looking after full time aren't all where we want them to be. We've been doing a lot of replanting. We've done a lot of top working to change varieties. So we have been, and we still are really, very much in a state of flux and a stage of getting set up. And so because of that, we've spent a lot of time exploring orchards and trying to meet people with orchards and get involved, I suppose. And through that, we've just realised how much of a resource there is that's not being tapped into in Somerset. There's huge amounts of really good old traditional orchards, and that's the kind of orchard that we work with, which aren't being harvested because for one reason or another, and mainly it's a combination of some of these orchards don't suit machine harvesting, and so then they're no good for the kind of commodity market. And the other thing is that a lot of the big makers, the factory makers, are moving more and more towards concentrated juice, and also more and more towards culinary and dessert fruit juice, which is usually concentrated. So that's been a huge move. And the other thing, I suppose, is that over the years, the volume of actual juice from actual apples that goes into those factory ciders has reduced and reduced, and it's roughly 35%, something like that now. So that's a huge difference. You know, two-thirds of that volume is no longer coming from apples, and so now what's happened is essentially there's a big surplus of cider fruit in not just in Somerset, but same in Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, Devon as well, and so. You know, there's a definite, particularly with the old orchards for us, we'll feel this sort of urge to try and do something about it. But to increase our cider production by that amount is actually quite difficult, because the upfront costs in terms of glass, the storage requirements, both in terms of tanks and then in terms of bottles, is really big, and we don't have space basically to do that, because all of our ciders spend some time in bottle. The minimum we would store anything is, I think, 6 months. So usually most of our ciders are in the bottle in the barn for a year, and if we were to then double that, we would just need a bigger barn. Becomes not possible. So distilling seemed like a kind of an obvious route to go by, basically, where we could utilise more of the resource that's available, and try and like protect these orchards, because ultimately that's the only way. They're only there to produce a crop, and they have all these amazing benefits for biodiversity and for carbon capture and stuff, but they're only there to produce apples. And if there's no apples being produced, with the best will in the world, even with people being into it and being interested, they just gradually, you know, decline, and they stop being orchards eventually. You know, one tree dies this year, a couple of trees dies the year before, and all of a sudden you've got 3 trees left in an orchard of 100 trees, and then a few years later it's not an orchard anymore. So that was kind of the starting point, I suppose, really. And then when we before doing this, we had a restaurant, and we were buying gin from these people in Bristol called 𝗪𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗲𝗏. And about the time that we sold the restaurant to make cider, they bought a beautiful big copper still to start making whiskey. And when they did that, they said, you know, well, maybe one day, if you want to distill some cider, we can do that for you. And so that planted the seed, and then straight away, really, we thought, well, we just need to give it a go and see how it works. So from our first full-time production was 2018. We started making cider in 2016 as a hobby, really. And then in 2018, we made our first full production, and we got 1,000 litres of that, took it down to the distillery. It's 1,000 litre still, so that's one batch. And it was delicious. And it was a real revelation trying that spirit for the first time, because it was so cidery. And we went down, they did it, and then you always need to like let it sit for a bit before you try it. You don't want to try it straight away. So we went back, and a week or so later, and it was in the sealed little barrel, opened the top of it. There was this instant smell. It was just the smell of the cider that had been in the tank beforehand. And that was very interesting, because I think often, I haven't drunk a lot of eau-de-vies before, really. I'm not really a spirit. I like some spirits, but that's not my background at all. I'm much more a cider drinker, a wine drinker, and occasionally a beer drinker. So didn't know a lot about spirits. And a lot of the eau-de-vies I've had are much fresher. They're they're fruity. They're very, you know, upfront with the fruit that it's made from. But as is quite different, I think, and it's got the flavours of a mature cider. So it's got the kind of aromas that you associate with tannins. It's got some of the kind of secondary fermentation characters, like it gets a butterscotch kind of flavour, toffee. We get licorice and star anise or fennel sometimes as being quite prominent flavours, and those all come from, or aromas I should say, those all come from the fermentation and the maturation. We let the cider mature for about 6 months before we distill it. And that I really like, because I think it's something that's very true to the orchards themselves. It's the type of fruit you have in the orchards in this area traditionally is that bittersweet fruit. It's rich, it's full-bodied, it has all the characters of like fallen leaves and butterscotch and ripe apple, and there's a whole kind of category of aroma which people often call bittersweet aroma, BSA for short, and it captures something that you just don't get in a Granny Smith, you don't get it in a Cox or something. And so yeah, I was quite pleased that the eau-de-vie came out like that, because sometimes these younger eau-de-vies, where it's a younger fermented liquid, whatever it is that's distilled, you get a lot of very fresh fruit from that. You know, it tastes appley, it tastes like black currants or whatever it is. But then you also quite often get a harshness with that. And I think, and I don't know why, I think it's partly to do with the quality of the still that they've got at Circumstance, and partly to do with the fact that the cider's matured. I think we get a very, very gentle, it's very complex, but it's gentle and it's smooth as a spirit. And it's quite, I can't explain it, but it's sweet. It has this feeling of being sweet in the mouth, and yet there's no sugar. You know, it's a physical impossibility that there's any sugar in it, because A, it's a dry cider, and B, it's been distilled, so there can't be any sugar in it, but it tastes sweet. And I've had people try it and say, oh, how much sugar do you put in this when you bottle it? But it has nothing. So yeah, that was quite an interesting, quite a revelation. And from drinking, I guess my sort of experience was drinking cider brandy and drinking 𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗧. So we had a bit of an idea about what happens when you put it in a barrel and give it 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And we've always really liked the Somerset Cider Brandy Company stuff, and especially the 15-year. And we had in our heads, it's mad, but why don't we just do 1 barrel a year and we'll leave it for 10 to 15 years and see how it is? Because the perception we had was that probably the young spirit would be more or less, not undrinkable, but just not sippable, like a sort of pretty raw thing for a hip flask or for cooking with or something. But actually what we've ended up with is quite sippable. And so then we had to sort of figure out how we approach it from then on, if you like, because so the first one we just bottled and released, that sold quite quickly. And then 2019 we did 6,000 litres to be distilled. So that gave us enough to fill a barrel for brandy. We've done a barrel with Pomona, or Pommeau as it is in France, so it's a blend of juice and spirit. And then a slightly larger release than the year before, but a small release of eau-de-vie, fresh. And so that was quite interesting, having a selection of different spirits to choose from. So we distilled them all, we kept them in neutral containers until they were all done, and then we went through and tasted all of them. And very different, each one from each other. And we've sort of taken a guess, really. The two that were the most fruity and instantly drinkable are the ones we've saved for eau-de-vie. The one that had the least complexity went into the Pomona, and then the ones that had more depth, I guess, went into barrel for aging. And there was one which had a bit of it was a bit fiery, and like the first batch that we did wasn't so fiery, so it had like a real fire to it. And I think in the barrel that's probably good, because I think you always want some fire in a spirit. But for me, I also want it to be sippable, basically. Whatever we sell, it has to be sippable, rather than something you need to water down, or that makes your eyes, go wide, kind of thing. So we've put that into the barrel, and hopefully, some of that fire softens, but we ideally will retain some in the long term. And how long it ages for, I have no idea. So I think with the spirit we have, personally, I just like to have that in I don't have a brandy glass, but a brandy glass would be great. A wine glass is great. Basically something with a decent amount of space in it, but where the top of the glass comes in and narrows. Because what you're trying to do is give lots of room for the aromas to move around, and essentially they're evaporating and into the air, but you want to kind of capture that. You don't want to have a glass like that and it just all goes off into the room and you don't appreciate it, because really the smell is a huge part of it. Ultimately, what's left in that you know, it's this essence of apple, basically. So you've got alcohol, you've got some water, and then you've got aroma, and basically there's nothing else. And that's quite amazing that you start with, because cider is already a sort of a process of like narrowing down. You know, you take the apple and then you get rid of the solid bits, and then you turn the sugar into alcohol, and everything mellows and develops and kind of concentrates in a way, and you get these secondary flavors of aroma. But then you take, you know, 1,000 liters of cider, put it in the still, and what comes out is about usually sort of 65 to 70 liters of spirit, strong, about 70% roughly, it's a double distillation process. And then we add water, like filtered water, to get it to what you think is right for drinking. So we did lots of tests, and we figured out for us 40% was a nice balance. It's very drinkable at that stage, but it's not too drinkable. It's, you know, it's got some fire still. It's got some heat to it when you drink it, but you get to appreciate the aroma a lot. Because I think basically the stronger you go, the more concentrated the aroma is, and there's something quite amazing about that. But the more alcohol you have, the less you appreciate it, the more that just goes up your nose and wipes everything out of your head. So if you do it at, say, 35, and sometimes people can add a little water if you want to add a little water to spirit. At 35, it's very sippable, but the aroma's not as concentrated, and you don't really have any heat. And then at 45, the aroma's much more concentrated, but the heat is off-putting, and it's much less sippable. And 40, I think, is about pretty much spot on, really, I think. So yeah, I always recommend drink it at room temperature as it is in a glass. I don't add ice or anything, and then just like take the time and sniff it, really. And that sounds pretentious, but I think that's ultimately that's what it is. You know, it's somewhere in, but you know, it's not like drinking cider or drinking wine. It's like drinking a smell, basically. And so it's kind of it's almost, I'm not a smoker, but I imagine it's more like having a cigar in a way, that you're just appreciating that feeling of that in your nose and in your mouth. And so it's kind of, it is an expensive thing, obviously, but in a way it's quite good value, because you get so much more in terms of the time you spend enjoying it. If you compared that to like a bottle of cider or a pint of cider, way longer per pound of, you know, value you would spend, I would say, enjoying that, because it's so much more concentrated. Basically, you know, it is this intensely concentrated thing, and in a 350 ml bottle, there's about 7 kilos of apples in there. And what you've lost water, the skin, the pips and whatnot, and you're just putting all of the aroma from that into that bottle, basically. So you're getting a lot in there, which I think is amazing. I mean, it's also totally mad, really, if you think about it, that like you go through all this this process, because we handpick all our fruit. It says on the bottle mostly handpicked, but actually it's all handpicked. We've never actually, we're covering ourselves, because we've printed these labels. To do the labels, the way we do our labels is really expensive. So we've printed like loads in one go, 1,000 in one go, and then it makes it cheaper, and then we use them over multiple years. So just in case, you know, we ever think, oh, we'll just do a ton by machine, because they're really hard and they're easy. But like on the whole, we pick everything by hand. So it's, you know, it's all this picking by hand, and then lifting by hand into the trailer, and then it takes them up to the barn, and then lift out by hand, and then into the water, we wash them all by hand, and then into the mill, and then we press it in an old press, you know, shoveling. Well, it's not an old press, but it's the old style rack and cloth press, shoveling it. And then it's, you know, all this time fermenting it, and then maturing it, distilling it, and you're just getting, every time you're just getting less and less, and then it goes into the barrel, you know, and in 10 years' time, if it goes into the barrel at cask strength at 65%, and I think from what I can tell from the research we've done, if it comes out 10 years, it'll come out at 55% or 50%, and you'll have lost 25% of the volume. So it's just getting even more narrowed down to this thing that ultimately it just could be, I just think, really, hopefully incredible. And I hope so. I don't know. It is, yeah. So it doesn't make any financial sense. And yet people look at it as, you know, it is really expensive, you know, compared to other things. But actually, I don't think it's not actually expensive. Other things are really cheap, basically, because per small bottle, the duty is £4 something, £4.40 or something. You know, the VAT is like, depends where you buy it, but you know, the VAT is 20% of the thing. So if it's like on some places, it's on the shelf at 40 quid. So 20% VAT, £4 of it is the duty. And then the bottle is like 75 pence, 77 pence, I think. The cap is nearly 30p for a cap because we wanted one with real wood and cork. We didn't want to have plastic. The wax costs about 5 pence per bottle. The label is 55 pence. And then that you haven't even taken into account what's in it, you know? And like actually, once you take it back, you know, it basically covers costs of production, and maybe a little bit for the time it takes us to write the labels. So it's a labour of love, really. But I think it's really fun, and it just makes sense. I think it just makes sense. It's a way where the difference between the cider we make for the eau-de-vie and the cider we make for cider is that because with the cider for selling in bottles, because we don't add anything, the blend of the fruit has to be right, and especially for a dry cider, getting the blend of acid, tannin, and aroma right is really hard because there's not sort of much of a window of opportunity. You know, if you add a bit of sugar, and for the ones that we don't add sugar, but we have some sweet ones, which is natural sugar, then you've got a lot of leeway. You know, it can be like mega tannic and mega acid, and you put the sugar in, and the sugar brings it into balance. The sugar really like dulls your sense of everything else. And with a dry cider, you don't have that. So if the acid is a little too high, it tastes really dry and sharp and full on. And if the acid is too low, it can be really flabby and dull and not lively on the tongue. And if the tannin is too high, people are like, God, this is a dry one, you know. And if the tannin's low, they're like, God, this is a sweet one. And there's no sugar in either of them. And I think, so for us, blending those dry ciders, and we're doing it at the start of the process. So there's a lot of trial and error involved over the last few years, and there's a lot of like adjustments for the future. But I think we're starting to get there. Blending those ciders it puts a lot of demands on in terms of what fruit goes where, and so very often we're like jealously guarding one thing to be for this cider because we need every drop of it, or you know, trying to spread certain things out because you want a bit of it but not much. Whereas with the spirit, you're not going to get any acid or tannin taste in the finished thing. So if it's a bit too sharp, the cider for drinking, it's not going to cause a problem for the spirit, and if it's a bit too tannic for drinking, it's not going to cause a problem. So what we kind of have worked out seems to work is to go very much heavily on the bitter sweets, and then enough acid to keep the fermentation safe, because it's a natural, it's a wild fermentation, and there's no control of it in terms of sulfites or anything. And in fact, you can't add sulfites for that because you distill that sulfites and it becomes really dangerous, potentially poisonous, which I always think is interesting because a lot of cider makers say, you know, oh, you have to put sulfites in a cider, otherwise it's going to be terrible, you know, it's going to be an absolute disaster. And then, but if you're doing it for distilling it, absolutely, you cannot, you know, I always think that's absolutely ridiculous. You know, there's this kind of ridiculous thing where people, they do it their way because that's the way they do it, and they've never tried it any other way, so they wouldn't know. But like, you don't need to put sulfites in stuff. We never ever put sulfites in anything, and we've never had, you know, we get little things that some people would call a fault probably, but we've never had anything go badly wrong, and ever, you know, and that's in like, I don't know, 100 batches, nearly, something like that. So I think that's fine, and I think that's been great for us. Is working on. It means we can work on a bigger scale by doing the spirits, and we can be very, very selective with our blending for the ciders now, and we don't need to worry about. And everything else, as long as the quality of the fruit is good individually, and as long as the blend of the whole works with acid and with acid and the bittersweets, then that's fine. So we're sort of blending for like 75 to 85% bittersweet, and then the rest is sharp or bitter sharp. And that seems to be the thing for like the quality producers in 𝗬𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀 basically, is that they have that they boast about how much bittersweet they have, and we have absolutely loads of bittersweet here. So that's been the sort of the starting point, and then you look at the, France is quite interesting. They've got rules for everything, and they've got the grades and stuff. And like the lowest grade of 𝗬𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀, I think the cider's fermented in less than 3 weeks. And then as you go up the grades, it gets older. But the top grade is only like a month or something. And then the best producers seem to be, they ferment and then age for about 6 months. And that's what we're kind of following. The longer you leave it, the more of a risk there is of oxidation and either like getting vinegar developing, which is not going to be good because that will get transferred in the still, or the kind of cardboardy, musty oxidation that you get with the veil yeasts. So we obviously want to avoid that. So we're trying to keep it for that kind of 6 months. This year it's been going really slow, and so we've only distilled 2 batches so far this year, and like even a month ago some of them still hadn't finished fermenting. I think like cider spirits, whether it's eau-de-vie or a brandy, they're good with food, and they're good in food as well. And like the classic thing is obviously chucking it in a frying pan and deglazing with it, and that is really good, and it smells incredible, I think. But actually, I quite like it in a direct way without heat. So, and I think particularly like if you have a really nice, drinkable, approachable eau-de-vie, adding like a tiny bit of it to something like strawberries. So if you take some strawberries and then sprinkle a little sugar over them, add a tiny bit of that and maybe a tiny bit of lemon juice or something, then you're getting all the aroma. You're not evaporating it all off in the pan. You're getting a good amount of aroma, and like that, I think is really, really nice to do. I think cider brandy and eau-de-vie can be really good with dessert because they have that. They've got a lot of aroma and they've got a lot going on, but there's not a lot of it. You're only going to drink a little measure, and I think especially at the end of a big meal, you're having a pudding, and you want to have the pudding, but you're like pushing yourself maybe. To then have like a sweet wine with that is kind of insane because you've got all this sugar, and you don't want to have another thing that's really, really sweet, and a glass full of like a sweet wine or an iced cider or something. There's a hell of a lot of sugar in that, and so I think it's probably like 10% sugar, that thing. So I think actually to have like a spirit, you have a small measure, like volume-wise, in terms of your stomach, is reasonable, and you can enjoy it over a long period of time. It's not like it's going to get too warm and then be flabby, or it's not going to kind of lose its bubbles and go flat and be uninteresting. So it's something you can enjoy really nicely with pudding, and the heat of it, the fire of the alcohol, kind of works quite nicely with anything like sticky or overly sweet or really rich, because it slightly refreshes the palate as you're drinking. So that I think is really nice. Obviously it's great as a digestif. So after dinner drinking that, either eau-de-vie or a brandy, particularly like a cider brandy, I think, for that kind of place. And then it's nice it's quite nice in puddings as well, not just the fruit thing, but like a brandy in going into like, I love those old school English puddings, like syllabub and like trifles and stuff. I love a bit of cider brandy and an apple trifle, or any trifle, that's great. So I think that kind of thing is nice. You're just anywhere where its intensity and its aroma is going to add something without the alcohol spoiling it. So you wouldn't put it on like a little fish dish, I don't think. But I think, yeah, into like puddings, it works really nicely. And then the classic way, obviously, of like frying some meat and then deglazing and adding, there's like Somerset pork, which is like, pork with cider and cream and bacon, very similar to Normandy pork, but in Normandy it's 𝗬𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 instead. So nowadays you've got options. You can make Somerset pork and you can put a bit of cider brandy in it. So yeah, I think it works in that. It just gives it this like something else. There's an extra dimension. It is kind of amazing. It's also, you know, the next step on that ridiculous process that I told you about. You've got this thing which is already ridiculously concentrated, then you chuck it in a pan and you evaporate 99% of it, but it does add something quite interesting, I think, and quite delicious. So yeah, I think that's something I'd definitely recommend it going into like a dish with meat, and especially with cream. Because I guess for us, like one thing about us is we're doing 1 barrel a year, and so that's quite different to what most people do. Because then that's a decision. What barrel you use is a big decision, you know. So we're only at the moment aging, and probably definitely for the foreseeable future, maybe forever, we're only going to do 1 barrel a year of cider brandy, and that's because of our methods. One barrel of cider brandy is about 3,000 litres of cider, nearly. So it's a very big thing, really, to make 1 barrel of it, and especially because we're picking by hand, and then we're doing a lot of the processing by hand. So we had to decide what barrel to put it in, because it's very much all your eggs in one basket. On the whole, we did research in what they do in 𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏, where this whole process is the same as we're doing, and it's very highly developed there. They use about 30% new oak every year, and the rest is old, and mostly very old. So there might be 100-year-old barrels. So essentially they're completely neutral by that stage. And they will also have the opportunity to move barrels between 𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗏 production, Pommeau production, and cider production, and so they can have this whole range of, you know, different casks they're getting, and then different uses previously. So then when they're making a blend, they've got, you know, I don't know how many they would have, let's say 20, 30 things to choose from. And that gives you a lot of flexibility. We don't have any of that flexibility. So we had to find something we wanted it to be very good quality, and we wanted it to give some new oak character, but not too much. So in the end, we went for Sauternes casks because they're very good quality. They're always French oak. They're always from the best cooperages in France, and they're always like the top of the range barrels, basically. They only have one fill of a very good quality, sweet, aromatic, deliciously fruity thing, and they are only in there for something like 3 to 5 years. So what you have is something that's still got new oak character, but most of that's been stripped out, so it's not going to be too overwhelming. And then it's got these aromas of like apricot and honey and raisins and almonds, and I mean the smell of it when it arrived was absolutely insane. So we've put the spirit in there, and basically the two things that are happening when you're aging, you're oxidizing it slowly, and you're adding the flavour and the colour from the barrel. And I think that's something people don't understand necessarily, because often you drink spirits and you're drinking whiskey, and so it's brown, whiskey's brown, and you hear about like smokiness and peatiness, and peaty water's brown. So when it comes off the still, it's absolutely completely clear, it looks like water, the same with any spirit. And so all of that colour and a lot of the flavour is added from the barrels. And I think in our case, I think with a fruit spirit, you have a lot of fruit flavour coming in the original spirit. So you have to not hide that too much and not lose that. But you want to be adding other stuff to it. And I hope this is going to work. You know, you never know, but I hope this is going to work. The idea is that we have this combination of like the apple and the cideriness, and the toffee and the orchard smells that we get in our eau-de-vie. And then layered onto that, we'll hopefully have sort of raisins and apricots and honey and those kind of things. And then then you obviously get a certain amount of oxidation, and you're actually oxidizing. My understanding of this is not great. I'm not an expert, but my understanding is that the spirit is stripping certain things out of the barrel, which then oxidize. So you're oxidizing some of the tannins from the barrel, as well as oxidizing you're adding oxygen to the aromas as well. And then, as well as oxygen coming in through the barrel, you're also getting a lot leaving. So you lose ABV, you lose some of the sort of higher end aromatics and higher end alcohol-y things, which is where the harshness comes. So like the older it gets, the more mellow, the smoother it gets, and the darker it gets in colour. So hopefully what we have will be very like, I hope, sweet, mellow, smooth, very, very complex. So it's like added a layer of complexity, and very sippable and very expensive. Unfortunately, just that's how it will be. So hopefully it's nice enough to kind of justify that, really. Because ultimately that's the, like, you know, when you get into these kind of spirits, it is kind of going to become a bit of a connoisseur's drink thing. You know, it's like it's a special occasion. It would have to be a special occasion drink. You know, you buy your dad one for Christmas or whatever, and hopefully it justifies that sort of enjoyment. But it will be, you know, one barrel is very limited run. I saw something recently, like a whiskey. It was very old, but it was like they'd found in the corner of their warehouse. I mean, you know, there's absolutely no way that HMRC would let you just find like 7 casks in the corner of your warehouse from 1980, whatever. But it was old, and they were saying, you know, ultra limited run, and they were like £3,000 a bottle, and they had like 4,000 bottles of it. For us, an ultra limited, you know, our first batch of eau-de-vie was 250 bottles, and our second 580, and I think the cask is only going to be, I don't know how many bottles it'll be. It will be about 550, 600 bottles, a small, little, tiny, you know, tiny bottles. So that's a limited run, you know. So yeah, don't want it to be too expensive, but it is going to be quite expensive, unfortunately. Yeah, but you know, buy one, save up, buy one. Don't share it. Yeah, I think there will be a growth in doing this, like distilling cider, and I hope there will anyway. And I think that what needs to happen really is people need to appreciate the resource that we have in terms of orchards still, but and then realise that one of the most logical ways to exploit that resource is in distilling, and that's because a lot of these orchards don't necessarily have the exact requirements to make like a very, very fine cider naturally, and I know that's not what everyone wants to do, but they also aren't efficiently laid out enough, the old orchards, to be viable for modern day commodity production of cider, basically. So I think there are certain people, farmers, landowners, who might have quite a bit of orchard, you know, and I know people who maybe have, you know, I can think of farms where there might be like 50 acres of orchard, 100 acres of orchard. They're not really getting any money for it. They keep them because they're there and it's cheaper to not take them out than to take them out, or maybe there's tree preservation orders in some cases, or maybe they have like a personal connection, they love them. But a lot of these people are getting like £45 a tonne from a contract picker to pick them for a factory. That's just not worth it to do anything with them. But to then become like a full proper cider maker is really difficult, I would say, at that scale. You know, to turn 50 acres of, like, that's huge risk. And if you discover that your fruit was, you know, it might have been planted for Taunton cider back in the day, or Showerings or something, they had what they wanted, you know. You might find it's 95% bittersweet, 90% bittersweet. It's the wrong balance, you know. For my mind, to make the kind of cider we make, that's totally the wrong balance. So what are you going to do? You could plant a new orchard with sharps and bitter sharps to compensate for that. That's going to take a long time. You could graft, that's a skilled thing. Again, that takes quite a lot of work and time. Or you could make spirit, and you could make, I bet, incredible spirit from some of these old traditional orchards. And because it's a high value product, potentially, if you do the sums right and you're clever about it, you can potentially make enough money to maintain a traditional orchard properly on that kind of scale in a way that you can't if you're going to just turn it into like fizzy 𝗏 style cider. Because the thing in that side, you know, and I know there are makers, I'm sure they're obviously making way more money than we are, but they're making like way more cider than we are. So your pound per pint, not even a pound per pint, your pennies per pint that you make in profit on that style of cider is like tiny compared to what you would make if you're making like a higher quality thing. So you know, I don't know. It's like saying like, oh, we'll be like the next Blackthorn or we'll be the next Thatchers or something. It's a bit like saying, oh, we'll be the next Tesco's. Because like the money you would have to invest, you're investing like tens of millions of pounds to kind of get to that stage. All those people who have done it gradually over generations. As far as I can tell, I don't think anyone's done it, in a decade or two. So that's not an option, basically. That's just not an option for anyone who wanted to start out. But I definitely think getting into distilling, there are distilleries around now. That's one of the great things about this gin boom and the Treasury being a bit more relaxed about distilling, is that now there are places you can go and get it distilled. And so all you've got to do is, make the base cider, basically.